On a quiet November afternoon in 1971, a man walked onto a plane with nothing but a briefcase and a calm smile. Hours later, he vanished into the night sky with $200,000, leaving behind only a tie and a trail of questions. Who was he? How did he disappear without a trace? And why do we still wonder about him half a century later? Tonight, we'll begin with that quiet boarding and slowly retrace the steps of the man now known only as D.B. Cooper. Before we begin, just a gentle reminder to like and subscribe. It helps Night Atlas share more stories with the world. On that November day, the air was sharp and cool as shadows grew long across the ground. Inside the airport, everything seemed calm and unhurried. Travelers moved through the gate, each one with their small bags and quiet thoughts, none expecting that the routine flight out of Portland would soon enter the pages of history. Among those passengers, one man walked forward without drawing extra eyes. He wore a plain suit, carried a briefcase, and moved with measured steps. Nothing about him stood out, and yet he would soon hold every life on the aircraft in his control. Once aboard, he made his way down the aisle and sat in seat 18E. He settled in with little fuss, buckled his belt, and pressed back against the seat as rows around him filled with chatter. At that time, smoking was common on planes, and he slipped a cigarette between his fingers and lit it with the ease of habit. The faint smoke curled into the stale cabin air, blending with the dull hum of engines and the soft shuffle of the crew tending to passengers. He looked like any other business traveler. To anyone glancing his way, there was no reason to think twice. As the wheels lifted and the plane rose smoothly toward its short trip north, the man stayed quiet. He placed a drink order, listened when the crew moved past, and appeared no more than another face among dozens. But soon after climbing to altitude, he reached into his jacket and held out a slim folded note toward the flight attendant beside him, Florence Schaffner. At first, she slipped it away with no glance, assuming it was no more than a slip of contact details or polite words from yet another traveler who wished for conversation. For a moment, the flight stayed as steady as before. The man, however, leaned closer and spoke in a low, controlled tone that left no doubt. That short message she had brushed aside was not meant for friendly talk at all. When she opened it at last, the words carried a weight that transformed the smooth flight in an instant. The paper made clear that within the plain briefcase at his side rested more than papers or clothing. Schaffner realized she was now in the presence of a man who claimed to hold a bomb. Her first thought was disbelief, for nothing about his behavior matched the picture of danger. He had not raised his voice. He had not stood, nor did he grab at her arm or make a scene that might alarm others. He sat still, composed, dressed with care, his hand steady as he sipped his drink with the other. Yet even with this stillness, she now grasped the true edge of the note. In her hands, the calm was broken. Quietly, her eyes lifted back toward the passenger who watched her with firm patience. The strange clash was striking. Around them, conversations about work, about families, and about holidays carried on with mild laughter and untroubled tones. Ice clinked in glasses. Pages of magazines turned with steady rhythm. But in the small space between row 18 and the rear aisle, something else took root. The mood carried a sharpness only she could feel, for only she now knew that the aircraft no longer flew under its own course. The still figure by the window had made sure of that. Florence paused, testing for any crack in his words or gesture. Was this man bluffing? Could this remark simply be some poor attempt at humor? But then she caught the quiet steel in his stare, matched with the small nudge of the briefcase at his knee. Whether or not it contained what he claimed, the risk was clear. She understood that the fate of the craft, crew, and every passenger now rested in what came next. The moment of calm she had known since takeoff was already gone. Observers later spoke of this man's strange presence, how he never raised panic, how he never created noise. But in that moment, what stood out to Schaffner was his control. He did not need to yell. He did not need to rush. His slow and exact way of speaking made his aim plain, to steady the flow of events without ever turning to chaos. Each small choice, the way he stayed seated, the way he passed instructions only to her, the way he kept watch without fuss, built a new rhythm in the cabin. It was not chaos, but silence that now guided the path of Flight 305. The shift was almost invisible. One man had taken the silent thread of the flight into his hands, and he pulled it without ever alerting those around him. In quiet, with a small note pressed into a flight attendant's hand, he had moved an entire craft onto a new track. What he sparked could no longer be undone. Schaffner's choice to treat the note as real had changed the direction not just of her shift, but of every life on that plane. With each second, what began as one man's stillness spread, shaping the steps that soon gripped the crew. The core of the story begins here, where stillness hid something greater. No sudden noise, no clash of force, no panic. Instead, with smoke rising from a lit cigarette, with a drink at his side, the quiet man at 18E held the fate of a full cabin in his calm grip. History remembers hijackings as sharp bursts of rage or noise, yet this case began with silence. That is what makes the moment unsettling. The way power gathered itself was so little seen, so little heard. This was the first link in a chain that could not be undone. From the instant Florence Schaffner recognized the message as a threat, the balance on board shifted forever. Whether or not the passengers knew, the path from Portland to Seattle would now unfold under one man's plan. The note was only a few words on paper, yet it set in motion an event unlike any other recorded at that time. Still and patient, the figure by the window had rewritten the flight. So the case starts not with raised voices, but with a whisper and a folded sheet of paper, not with alarms, but with a calm mask that covered something deeper. The quiet of that moment carried its own power, and within it was the spark of a mystery that would endure for generations. The question that now hung in the air was simple. How would the crew, faced with this calm but certain demand, respond in the minutes that followed? Picture the quiet of that cabin now, a silence heavy with hidden meaning. The folded note had been read, its weight carried to the cockpit, and soon the man in 18E began to reveal exactly what he wanted. His words, steady and without hesitation, carried requests that sounded almost mathematical in their precision. $200,000, 4 parachutes, and enough fuel to keep the aircraft ready for a long stretch through the night. He didn't bargain or ramble. He simply stated clear terms, and in doing so, created a moment where every life on board depended on how seriously his wishes were met. The cash, he specified, was to be collected in $20 bills, a detail so slight and yet so important that it immediately suggested this was no impulsive plan. Smaller denominations meant lighter bundles, easier to handle, easier to secure. To the outside world, it may have looked like an odd preference, but on this plane, it was one more sign that he had thought carefully about each step before ever lighting his cigarette in that seat. And then came the request for parachutes, not one, not even two, but four. It was this detail that spun the minds of those coordinating the response. Why four? Perhaps he intended to take hostages and leap with them, forcing authorities to play safe in how they equipped the gear. Trickery seemed to lie at the heart of it, as though by asking for multiples, he tied their hands into giving him working, safe parachutes rather than risk him strapping a fellow passenger to unreliable equipment. It was a calculated way to ensure his demands were met without suspicion that they could be sabotaged, and once again, it hinted at a level of foresight not found in ordinary criminals. The crew, the ones caught in the middle, now became quiet messengers between Cooper and the people on the ground. Picture Tina Mucklow standing by the small rear phone in the cabin, one hand steady on the receiver, repeating his words into the line so they could reach officials unseen on the tarmac. Each relay of his calm tone carried urgency, yet she herself was measured, mirroring his composure in order to preserve any thread of stability within that narrow fuselage. In those minutes, she became the connecting voice, her calm becoming as vital as any piece of equipment on the plane. Meanwhile, below them, an airline scrambled. The logistical dance suddenly had a timer on it, gathering 200,000 in small bills, preparing chutes suitable for use, and finding fuel trucks able to roll into place at the right time. Banks had to move quickly yet carefully. Authorities had to record serial numbers, and the airfield had to prepare for a meeting staged in silence. It was as if the entire city of Seattle bent itself, unseen by the passengers above, into complying with the quiet demands of the man who sat mid-cabin with unwavering focus. The curious thing was how Cooper delivered these requests. There was no frenzy, no rising pitch of panic. His tone, described again and again as composed, gave the impression that he was not grasping wildly for control, but carrying out steps in a routine known only to him. Every choice, from the denomination of the bills to the number of parachutes, had purpose. None of it suggested recklessness. Instead, it communicated the presence of someone who had studied, perhaps even rehearsed, for a night like this. To imagine the strain in the cockpit is to appreciate the balance at play. The pilots had to steer and circle above while absorbing instructions that turned their routine flight into a tense standoff. They held altitude and followed patterns, all while trusting the calm intermediary at the back to pass between them and the man who quietly controlled their fates. And through it all, Cooper's stillness anchored the strange normalcy of the cabin. The passengers looked out of windows, adjusted their watches, and carried no clue at all. The parachute demand alone sparked endless debate then and continues to do so now. Some have wondered whether it was mere bluff, an attempt to spread fear of possible hostages. Yet within that demand was protection for him as well. They could not hand him a faulty chute, not knowing whether he might clip one onto an innocent. It set in motion a safeguard that ensured he would receive gear that was both functional and reliable, narrowing the chances of a deadly trick. In its simplicity, it was among the most clever pieces of his plan, one that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than luck. In the still air of that flight, the weight of these demands pressed against the hands of those attempting to meet them. Imagine now the counting of bills, the hands quickly stacking 20s into organized amounts. See the parachutes laid out, inspected. With hurried care, each chosen for a purpose only Cooper knew. Hear the sputter of fuel trucks shifting into place, engines humming as they prepared for the meeting that loomed on the tarmac. All of it unfolded in silence to the passengers above, who must have thought the circling through the sky was routine. They sipped drinks, adjusted coats, and sat comfortably, unaware that they were part of a calculated bargain invisible to their eyes. And so, even with time slowed to the crawl of circling over Seattle, the man's certainty distinguished him. He did not act with the desperation of someone cornered or foolish. His calm shaped the reactions of all, a steady hand among trembling possibilities. In these choices, we catch sight of someone who carried not only a plan, but confidence in its execution, however risky it might appear from the outside. The requests had been made. They were clear, immovable, and they left the airline and FBI with only one option: comply. By stating them so plainly, he closed off space for refusal. His quiet ensured their seriousness, and his calm insisted they be met. This moment wasn't about chaos or shouting. It was about measured choices, each one sewn carefully into the fabric of a plan that was unfolding step by step. And as the crew followed through, circling the Seattle skies, a strange normalcy continued for those passengers unaware of how finely balanced their world suddenly was. Drinks poured, lights dimmed, voices murmured as though it were any other ordinary evening flight. Yet just beyond them in the rear, a phone passed between hands. Messages traveled like currents, and a man sat upright, collecting his pathway out of sight. His plan was built not on panic, but on quiet practice, and in that stillness, the stage was prepared for what would follow when the waiting finally reached its end. Picture this: the hum of engines carrying the plane through cold November skies, the seats filled with men and women who believed they were on nothing more than a short hop into Seattle. Some ordered a drink, others shifted to get comfortable with a magazine or a cigarette. To them, the cabin held nothing unusual. Yet only a few feet away, a quiet agreement had already changed the course of their entire journey. The man in 18E had made his terms known, and the crew now carried an invisible burden that shaped their every move, while the passengers around them continued in tranquil ignorance. Imagine the pressure set upon the flight attendants at that moment. Their task was no longer about serving drinks or answering routine questions. Now, they bore the responsibility of protecting everyone on board, not by confronting the threat directly, but by concealing it. The calm they projected to the cabin was a veil pulled over a far more fragile truth. Behind polite smiles and steady hands, they communicated quietly with the cockpit and returned under the gaze of the hijacker, ensuring his demands were passed like instructions in a delicate code of trust. Their ability to keep the ordinary veneer intact was perhaps their greatest shield against panic. It was Tina Mucklow who became the key link between the man in the rear and the pilots in the cockpit. She wasn't just carrying messages, she was embodying composure, matching the careful way he spoke with quiet steadiness of her own. Each time she picked up the cabin phone at the back, poised in the shadow of the aft door, she balanced two worlds, the one filled with unsuspecting passengers asking for a pillow or a drink refill, and the one where ransom amounts and parachute preparations were being relayed into the night air. In her, the crew found not only a messenger, but a center of poise that made it possible to endure the rising weight of the situation. Above the city, the plane moved not forward to its destination, but in circling loops, a holding pattern that lasted long into the evening. Each circle hidden beneath the clouds meant more time for law officers and airline staff on the ground to meet the strange set of terms. For passengers, this meant only a minor delay. Perhaps they thought it was weather or congestion at the airport, nothing outside the range of the normal explanations travelers give themselves. The minutes ticked by without alarm, an entire cargo of lives maintained in calm suspension while negotiations and preparations unfolded without their knowledge. What a contrast it must have been. Within the cabin, the clink of glasses as passengers finished the last sips of a beverage, conversation drifting across aisles, the routine sounds of air travel. And yet, only a few steps away, a man sat smoking quietly, watching the minutes pass, with a plan already set in place. No raised voices gave him away. No frantic moves betrayed the fact that the airline's entire attention bent toward him. This contrast deepened the tension. An illusion of peace spread across the cabin while the true center of gravity rested in a single figure whose every choice dictated the flight's course. The pilots, high in the cockpit, knew the stakes yet showed no outward disturbance. They received Tina's careful words over the intercom with patience and restraint. Their hands remained steady as they kept the aircraft circling in wide arcs. Beneath them, officials scrambled to gather money, check parachutes, and roll fuel trucks into alignment until it was ready. Time stretched endlessly, and still the passengers sat unaware, looking through small oval windows at the darkening mist, perhaps noticing nothing unusual at all. From this angle, the suspense did not rise from loud tension, but from concealed truth. The knowledge sat heavily on only a handful within the cabin: the pilots, the crew, and Cooper himself. Together, they carried a secret drama, while the others floated within it unknowingly. Few situations reveal as powerfully the gulf between appearance and reality. The illusion of safety was preserved not by force, but by deliberate calm, and it worked. Panic never spread because panic never had the chance to spark. As the minutes became hours, the crew grew skilled at moving through their tasks as if nothing had changed. Mucklow walked the cabin, sometimes carrying out small requests from passengers, other times returning to hear or repeat Cooper's words. Florence Schaffner remained poised, giving no indication of the note she had once taken with trembling hands. The balance of calm rested with them, because they kept the mask of normal routine firmly in place. The passengers themselves never joined the circle of fear. The threat remained hidden, tucked away between row 18 and the narrow path to the cockpit, visible only to those whose work tied them to it. For those passengers, the landing in Seattle came as a curious but uncomplicated stop. They may have felt relief to be on the ground, perhaps a touch of impatience at the delay, but none understood how close they had been to peril. One by one, they collected coats, bags, and stepped off the plane with the same casual pace they might have brought to any flight. Their conversations carried only the usual remarks about weather, about being late, about dinners waiting at home. They did not know that moments earlier, the exchange of decisions, money, and negotiation had been playing out under their very seats. This is where the strength of calm became the unspoken protector. No alarms had ever broken the spell. The passengers walked away unharmed and unfrightened. And in a strange reversal, the very mystery that Cooper created became deeper because it had unfolded in such serenity. He had managed to bend an entire airline, the FBI, and a fully loaded aircraft into the service of his plan, all while leaving the majority on board in complete innocence. The silence had preserved lives, but it had also thickened the riddle. For if a hijacking could occur in such quiet steadiness, what else might this man have managed once the doors closed again on the next stage of his escape? Now, with the passengers safe on the ground and the cabin emptied, only the crew remained. The ransom was ready, the parachutes delivered, and fuel prepared. All the pieces Cooper had asked for were sliding into place. And with fewer eyes upon him and fewer lives to shield, the next step emerged. The calm that had carried the first act forward was no longer the disguise. It became the bridge leading straight to his planned departure. With everyone else removed from danger, Cooper was now one step closer to disappearing into the night. The plane finally touched down in Seattle. The sky was dark, the air heavy with late autumn chill, and on the runway the scene had already been arranged. Waiting on the tarmac were the stacks of money bundled into bags, 4 parachutes laid carefully to one side, and fuel trucks standing by like silent watchers in the night. From the outside, the process seemed mechanical and organized, but every small action carried pressure. Each movement of ground crew, each turn of the plane's wheels, played into a carefully choreographed exchange between one calm man in row 18 and the many unseen forces now working to match his demands. For those on board who knew the truth, the landing was not the comfort it usually brings. The pilots guided the aircraft downward with steady hands, yet their thoughts were pressed against the uncertainty waiting below. Would something slip at this point? Would the hijacker lose control, or worse, decide to harm those still on board? Landing was supposed to be the safest part, yet here it marked the most delicate handoff of the night. The money, the parachutes, the refueling, every part carried the risk of upsetting a precarious balance that had so far been preserved by quiet composure. Inside the cabin, the man who called himself Cooper watched without giving away much. He had told the crew what would happen once they touched down, and he stayed calm, his posture upright, cigarette smoke still curling lightly into the air. When the aircraft finally slowed on the runway and taxis into position, his orders were firm but restrained. He wanted the passengers out, but the plane itself had to remain ready for more flight. This distinction showed a mind not simply focused on ransom. He was threading the needle between release and preparation, discarding the risk of witnesses while keeping the machine of escape intact. One by one, the passengers stepped down onto the wet ground outside. They carried coats, bags, and ordinary relief at being on solid earth again. To them, it was a landing with a slight mystery in its wait time, but nothing that betrayed the danger they had been shielded from. The crew escorted them out gently, keeping voices light, making sure no trace of alarm disturbed them. Cooper allowed this to happen. He never grew restless, never barked at the lines of departing people. Instead, he let the passengers leave in safety. It was a choice both practical and oddly considerate, turning his crime into something more unnerving. He had the power to harm but chose civility, and somehow That made his control even stronger. Once they were gone, only the pilots, a few attendants, and Cooper remained with the aircraft. Now the exchange moved forward. Outside, men moved carefully with bags of cash, each bundle of 20s recorded and accounted for in quiet haste. Then came the parachutes, 4 in total, delivered as requested, without any clear sense of how he would use them. For the few watching through cabin windows, the sight must have seemed eerie. There was no rush of heavily armed men, no dramatic confrontation. There was fragile silence. Objects passed from ground to plane while time stretched long into the night. And all the while, Cooper stayed polite. Accounts remember him as thanking crew members, speaking softly, and never raising his voice. In such interactions, there was an almost chilling calm. He was stealing, threatening, and bending everyone's will, yet doing so with manners intact. This civility made the situation unnerving because it carried no clue of when aggression might surface. It left everyone guessing, but also surviving. In the dark calculation of survival, politeness became his disguise and his shield. At last, the ransom was fully inside the cabin, $200,000 in small bills, packed and ready. The parachutes followed and lay within reach. With these items secured, Cooper still showed no sign of haste. He asked instead for the plane to be refueled, and the process drew on into the evening. Outside, tankers hummed as men followed safety steps in cold drizzle, hoses feeding fuel into the jet's body, while armed agents lingered at a distance, powerless to act. The moment the hijacker slipped or revealed weakness had not come, and so his plan remained unbroken. It is worth pausing to picture how this scene must have looked from inside. Through narrow ovals of glass, one might catch the glow of lamps on wet concrete, the silhouettes of ground crew moving slowly to and from the aircraft. A sense of ritual hung there. Items offered, instructions followed, silence preserved. At the center sat Cooper, surrounded now by the ransom money he had asked for, with 4 parachutes stacked like quiet promises in the dim rear cabin. So much had been risked to reach this point, yet nothing had interrupted the strange civility of his theft. When the refueling ended, Cooper called for the plane's next stage. His orders were unusual but precise. The aircraft was to fly low, no higher than 10,000 feet, and to travel at a slower speed than commercial flights usually held. The destination, he indicated, was not a clear city stop, but a path he would control as the flight continued. The pilots absorbed this information and accepted it. Cooper had ensured they remained compliant by never creating sudden fear, by maintaining a calm that now seemed inseparable from his command. His plan, though unfinished, showed itself now as something larger than a grab for money. He was preparing an exit few could have imagined, one that used the particular build of the Boeing 727 to his advantage. Its unique set of rear stairs, capable of descending mid-air, offered a possibility no ordinary passenger would even know about. And yet here he was, sitting with parachutes and ransom at hand, directing the crew to keep altitude low and speed manageable. Each piece of the puzzle aligned like steps rehearsed long before this night. The crew must have felt growing unease as they realized he did not intend to end this upon landing. His requests chained them into accompanying him further still. They were bound not only to the machine and the fuel, but to his hidden plan. And yet even so, he reassured them, never threatening their safety with violence, always carrying himself as if their survival mattered to him. That paradox, criminal intent wrapped in courtesy, made the night's exchange not a clash, but an eerie partnership between captor and crew. With the cargo now loaded, passengers gone, and fuel tanks replenished, the plane prepared to leave the ground once more, but this time it was not bound to an ordinary destination. It was now carrying the weight of ransom in tidy stacks, parachutes folded neatly beside it, and a mystery awaiting its sharp turn into history. The Seattle exchange had played out not with force, but with discipline, a steady rhythm of surrender and compliance that left Cooper stronger than before. The crew remained with him, bound to his plan, guiding the aircraft into unknowable paths. The path forward opened into darkness, and with it, the strangest stage was about to begin. Cooper had his money, his parachutes, and the plane under his command. Every eye on the ground now followed not the people released in safety, but the aircraft lifting back toward the night, carrying a hijacker who was calm, prepared, and one step from a leap that would turn him into legend. Somewhere between the city lights of Seattle and the desert valleys near Reno, a man simply disappeared into darkness. The aircraft, a Boeing 727 that carried only a handful of souls by this point, moved steadily through the heavy night air. The hijacker had made his plan clear, and now, little by little, the steps toward his last act were unfolding. Inside the cabin, the sense of waiting hung close. Behind closed doors of the cockpit, the crew gathered together, listening not to raised voices or shouts, but to faint movements, shuffling, dragging sounds, the clink of metal against fabric. These were not random noises. Each one belonged to a man preparing for something both daring and final. At some point after they lifted from Seattle again, Cooper asked the flight attendants to retreat to the cockpit with the pilots. They did so carefully, moving into the small forward space and shutting themselves in. From then on, the rest of the aircraft held only one figure. From the front, the crew heard the aft stair system unlock. It was a feature not common to most airliners, but present on this plane, a staircase that lowered directly from the tail, designed for boarding at small airports. It was not meant to be used in flight, and yet that is exactly what happened. The sound it made cut through the drone of engines, a metallic note signaling steps into the heart of his escape. In the tense minutes that followed, the cockpit held silence colored by faint interruptions. There were thumps as though a bag shifted. There was weight moving unevenly across the cabin floor, and some time later, the loud rush of outside air as the aft stairs bore the force of miles of wind blowing against them. No one looked back. They were instructed to stay put, and they obeyed. The curtain lay between them, but in their minds, vivid pictures formed. The man was arranging his gear, steady hands looping straps, fingers aligning buckles, and the ransom packages now tied carefully to one of the parachutes for transport. He had even removed his tie earlier, a simple strip of fabric abandoned among the items left behind. That detail alone spoke volumes. He was methodical, trimming away anything that may snag or give him trouble once he leapt. It was almost ritualistic, as though the tie had served its purpose during the charade of sitting unremarkably in a row, and now it was no longer needed for the leap into open air. In its place, a parachute strap would rest against his chest, drawn tight across the layers of his clothing. Though no one saw him in those moments, it is possible to imagine the calm sequence. Bundles of bills pulled and tightened into place, buckles secured with deliberate tension. Steps across the narrow cabin, checked with quiet repetitions. A pause, perhaps, to listen to the full roar of air outside before stepping closer to the gaping threshold at the tail. The orchestration was one few could attempt, let alone succeed within, but to those listening, it all sounded inevitable. Then came the lurch. At 8:13 in the evening, the aircraft recorded what was described as a sudden pressure bump. The nose of the plane dipped and then stabilized again, as though someone had shifted heavy load from within. The crew felt it, the instruments recorded it, and yet their eyes remained forward. That movement has long been believed to mark the exact moment Cooper took his step into the night. No alarm was raised, but the oscillation told a story that no words could have matched. Above them, invisible in clouds, military jets flew in shadow formation. They had been sent to follow, to observe, to lend warning in case of attack. Yet even these escorts saw nothing more than a black shape moving implacably across the sky. No figure parachuting out. No lights on a chute opening. Not even a shadow dropping through the cloud deck below. The act was swallowed entirely by the cover of night. They kept watch, but the sky yielded no sign of a man falling, only the storm and clouds stretched endless beneath their wings. Below, the wilderness waited. Hills, ridges, forests, and wide tracts of damp earth stretched across the northwest landscape. This was November weather. Cold rain, heavy winds, the kind of air that howls across treetops and slicks rocks with sheen of water. The darkness below was not forgiving. It carried no lights, no paths, only the wide blanket of night. Somewhere in that stretch, he descended. No one listening above knew if his parachute opened, if the package of money remained secured, or if he vanished in a way that left no chance of survival. The only certainty was absence. The crew carried on. They pulled the aircraft out of its circling pattern and guided it safely to Reno as ordered. On this final leg, a strange emptiness followed them. The hijacker, who had dictated their every move, was no longer present in the physical sense. The only reminders were within the cabin itself. Stairs lowered into night air, the tie left discarded, and cigarette stubs pressed to ash. When they brought the aircraft to the ground, authorities swept in expecting confrontation. But none was left. Cooper was gone. The ransom no longer sat aboard. The parachutes, apart from those he left unused, were missing. The doorway to the night had closed with him outside of it. Always the account ends the same. He left not with panic, not under fire, but by a choice as simple as stepping off into sky. His disappearance has lived longer than any sighting could, because no single eye bore witness to where he went. He became both legend and puzzle in a single instant, existing last in a record of instrument readings and the faint memory of air rushing through the tail of a jetliner. To speak of Cooper after that moment is only to speak of possibilities. In Reno, the crew answered questions. The plane was examined, and signs of the hijacking were cataloged, but the man himself had slipped away. By making the leap, he had chosen a path where only wild, dark forests and endless speculation could follow. The event became not just a crime, but a permanent shadow, a reminder of how a figure could control an aircraft, set terms, and then simply disappear. This was not merely a criminal act, it was the beginning of a story that to this day has no ending. The leap embodied mystery. A man with calm composure walked into uncertainty and left behind an image of survival or tragedy never confirmed. That night marked aviation with an unsolved question still carried softly into conversations even now. Where did he land, and who was he to begin with? The crew, relieved but unsettled, left Reno empty-handed. They had carried their aircraft as directed and returned without harm, but also without answers. The most daring act of the evening was carried by one man alone, and it ended the moment he vanished into wind. From there, the story shifted. Now the world took up the question, both on the ground in thick forest stretches and in the minds of investigators piecing together how far such calm calculation might have taken him. The search was about to begin, spreading across land and time, yet never quite catching up to the man who chose the night over certainty. The moment the aircraft touched down in Reno without its hijacker, the focus shifted. Authorities pieced together the last known details and began an effort unlike anything that corner of the Northwest had ever seen. By morning, skies above Washington and Oregon filled with helicopters and small planes, all combing the landscape for some sign of a parachute or discarded gear. On the ground, wet forests stretched deep, their branches heavy with November rain. Teams trudged over ridges, through thick brush, and into valleys, slick with mud. What they sought was anything at all, a torn chute draped over a log, footprints near a clearing, or a bundle of money spilled into the soil. Yet for all the energy poured into the search, silence replied at every step. Imagine those hillsides beneath gray skies. Entire crews of agents pressed forward day after day, marking maps and circling estimated flight lines on charts. They tried to guess where Cooper's leap might have taken him. Every calculation came back uncertain. Winds had shifted. The plane had moved in patterns not entirely straightforward. Instruments suggested one outline of a possible drop zone, but weather conditions and night flying made exact plotting impossible. Even with thousands of eyes scouring the terrain, the man they sought remained missing, as if the rain itself had swallowed him whole. In the rivers and lakes below the flight path, boats and divers joined the effort. Cold, dark waters were searched, shorelines checked for bundles that the hijacker might have lost in descent. Dogs followed scents that rarely turned into anything lasting. Communities nearby watched as convoys of vehicles moved in, their headlights inching through roads cut between evergreens. The search carried with it both urgency and routine. Urgency because Cooper had walked away with a fortune, and perhaps more than that, a mystery of how he survived his leap. Routine because each day ended without results, and each morning started another round of labor through damp soil and fog-bound passes. The FBI described the investigation as one of the largest ever organized at that time, and yet, for all its magnitude, emptiness dominated the reports. No parachute dangling from a fir tree, no shattered equipment left behind in panic, no sign of someone injured by a fall. Time after time, each lead brought crews back only to the natural silence of rivers and forests. Even the practical details, the weight Cooper carried, the gear he strapped to his frame, offered little certainty. The land simply gave nothing away. Military units even joined, trained in survival and reconnaissance, aiding in covering steep terrain. Local residents offered stories of strange sounds or rumors, but nothing fit into place. Hunters, loggers, and families living close to the potential zone became unofficial watchers, scanning their sections for signs. All the while, agents walked methodically, creating a patchwork of checked areas, but each patch yielded nothing. As days stretched into weeks, The puzzle deepened. The contrast between the sheer size of the search and the total lack of evidence grew difficult to ignore. Think of the maps that covered office walls as investigators worked late into the night. Lines crisscrossed the Cascade Range, circles approximated landing zones, and notes filled margins with probabilities. They calculated parachute drift, wind trajectories, and distances. Even with mathematics narrowed down to small target areas, the reality outside refused to cooperate. Those circles of highest likelihood were walked, flown over, and dragged by teams until they left with the same uncertainty they started with. Pieces did surface over time, scattered reminders that the man had been real. His black clip-on tie, removed before the jump, remained on board the aircraft itself. Cigarette butts left behind in his seat were gathered and bagged. At delivery, not all parachutes had left with him. A couple remained in the plane, later examined for clues that mostly told nothing. These fragments gave weight to the fact of his existence, yet none carried the answer that mattered most. Where did he land, and was he even alive after the plunge? Absence became its own answer. Investigation after investigation reported not discovery, but lack thereof. In a sense, Cooper's greatest achievement was not only exiting through the rear stairs into cold wind, but vanishing so completely afterward that the largest coordinated manhunt of the time could not find proof of his fate. The forests and rivers became a partner in his escape, refusing to yield any story about whether he struck ground hard, floated safely, or carried his fortune into survival. For locals, the search lingered in memory not as noise but as curiosity. How a man could parachute over their communities, watched by military escorts, and still simply disappear remained bewildering. Children in towns heard stories of agents stomping through brush. Hunters recalled encountering lines of FBI teams traversing slopes they themselves knew well. The presence gave no resolution. Only mystery pressed tighter into fabric of the place. The weeks of searching gave way to months, and still at most, investigators had fragments with no larger picture. The tie sat in a box. The cigarette remnants carried possibilities never fully tested. The unused chutes gathered dust in government evidence rooms. Through the years, files grew thick with interviews, theories, and carefully typed memos, but every time, the trail stopped at the point where Cooper pushed himself through the stairwell into wind and rain. What started as a clear image of a composed man in a business suit had now become almost ghostly. No body, no gear, no currency surfaced in the broad sweep immediately after the crime. Life in those forests continued as before. Storms soaking moss, rivers shifting soil, trees bowing in wind. The absence grew louder than any fact. It became the center of the case's identity. While many crimes are marked by what is left behind, this one became unique in what remained missing. When you pause to reflect on that, it's almost more unsettling than evidence itself. A face sat in seat 18E, spoke with conviction, accepted money and tools of escape, then left through the tail into nowhere. The largest net the Bureau could cast still pulled up empty. His disappearance wrote itself in quiet. Trails washed by rain, branches erasing marks, rivers carrying away hints. In time, the search slowly wound down, though investigations on paper continued. The unanswered questions became larger than the hunt itself. The story no longer followed only the man, but the gap he left. Absence took shape almost as clearly as his sunglasses and pressed suit once had. Everywhere people looked, nothing appeared. That nothing became the defining weight of the mystery. Years later, when memory of helicopters above and agents below began to fade into the background, the silence suddenly stirred. For after nearly a decade, far from the first search zones and in circumstances no one predicted, something would reappear. Not the man himself, but pieces of his fortune out of place and weathered by time. And with that single discovery along a quiet riverside, absence gave way again to deeper puzzles waiting still. Nearly 10 years passed before the case stirred again. By then, many believed the trail had gone completely cold. Investigators still filed paperwork, still spoke of possibilities, but time had dulled the energy once devoted to hunting through forests and rivers. Then, on the banks of a sandy patch along the Columbia River called Tina Bar, the story reawakened in the most unassuming way. A boy named Brian Ingram had been out with his family, enjoying the simple pastime of digging into the soft sand with shovels. What he found was not a rock, not a shell, but something far more unusual. As he unearthed the layers, small bundles of weathered $20 bills appeared, bound by crumbling rubber bands, their paper worn but still recognizable. Imagine that scene. The cool air off the river, the steady sound of water, and in the midst of an afternoon's outing, a child cupping in his hands what amounted to fragments of a long-gone ransom. At first, the sight must have seemed like treasure. Children naturally carry a sense of wonder in such discoveries. And here lay stacks of money buried in sand, aged but unmistakable. Yet, as parents took in what had surfaced, the tone shifted. This was not random currency scattered by the wind. It was part of the ransom issued to the man who had once stepped into the clouds from a jetliner. Each bill lifted from the sand seemed to carry his ghost, a reminder that his story had not sunk fully into myth. Authorities checked the numbers, and the confirmation was immediate. The bills matched exactly with the ransom recorded years before. Serial numbers were cataloged carefully in 1971, set aside in anticipation of just such a recovery. And now, almost a decade later, here they were, pulled not from a forest floor or from the wreckage of a parachute, but from the sand of a riverside beach. The exact count came to nearly $6,000, far from the full ransom, only a small slice. But its existence stirred the mystery as no map, no witness, and no theory had managed to do in years. The excitement of finding genuine ransom money soon gave way to questions that seemed more complicated than ever. How had those bills reached Tina Bar? The river's flow did not match predictions built by investigators back in 1971. Hydrologists had charted the Columbia's path and its connections for years. The river and Tina Bar lay downstream, away from the likely landing spots. For the bills to appear there, they would have had to undertake a winding, improbable journey through shifting currents, floods, and years of natural movement. Many experts saw the location as puzzling, even contradictory. It did not match the idea of a man falling into specific forest zones or striking into lakes under watch. Some suggested the bills washed down over time, carried piece by piece until resting within that sandy bank. Floods might have buried them, tides might have shifted them, winds could have covered them over seasons of erosion and deposit. It painted a picture of nature itself, carefully hiding fragments of money beneath silt and sand, only to surrender it decades later to the curious hands of a child. But this explanation left gaps. Why only that one cluster of bills, and why no others scattered farther upstream? The find was both proof of the hijacker's reality and evidence of geography resisting simple logic. Others proposed a more deliberate circumstance. Perhaps the money was not lost at random, but placed there intentionally. It could have been Cooper himself, planting part of the ransom in a location so strange it would never fit neatly into investigators' assumptions. By leaving behind a cluster, he could have forced confusion and shifted attention from his true path. Or maybe it was not him, but someone who came across the bills later, choosing to hide them again in a way that would mislead. In either variation, the act presented design rather than accident. Still more voices wondered if the money had been buried directly in the sand close to the time of the hijacking. Timelines showed the bills had deteriorated with years of exposure, but their placement seemed compact, tight together. It was as though someone opened the bundles at once and pressed them into the earth. This theory leaned toward intentional burial, perhaps by Cooper, perhaps by someone else entirely. Yet even that idea refused to settle comfortably. To bury them there required proximity and opportunity, both clouded by the lack of clear tracks or sightings from that decade. Whatever the explanation, the discovery unsettled the notion that the case trended toward closure. Instead of pointing directly to survival, demise, or flight, the buried cache muddied the waters. It gave proof without clarity, linking back to Cooper, yet stretching the story in directions that confused everyone. Some investigators admitted that the find worsened their chances of understanding, layering fresh contradictions on an already confounding file. The Bank of the Columbia became not a resolution, but a continuation. Imagine again that child standing with hands full of wet bills, unaware that his discovery was tethered to one of the most enduring mysteries in aviation. The casual nature of that day underscores how the extraordinary so often arrives through ordinary circumstances. A family outing, shovels in sand, and suddenly the crime that had haunted officials for years slipped back into the public eye with faded currency. Nothing dramatic, just worn paper money slowly drying in the autumn air. And yet, from that simple moment, a decade's silence broke. The recovered bills have since been examined, studied, and displayed as museum pieces, each one tinged with sand and history. Their textures carry the wear of river currents, the decay of rubber bindings stretched thin by weather, and the uncertainty of how long they were buried. But none of that sheds light on Cooper himself. The money surfaced without a man. It pointed backward to 1971 without illuminating what came after. Like footprints that vanish before revealing direction, the bills spoke only of contradiction. For if Cooper landed near that area, why no further trace nearby? If the money floated there, why such a compact grouping? If it was planted, who would risk burying evidence so close to open reach? Each answer seemed incomplete, forcing the case to breathe longer as a story untamed by conclusion. Money once thought lost forever returned not as resolution, but as invitation for endless speculation. Even now, Tina Bar stands as more than a riverside patch of sand. It is a place where one of the few confirmed relics of the case surfaced, stirring both public imagination and investigative debate. The Columbia carried those fragments into view, but not into certainty. It left behind questions heavier than the water itself. So the story paused once again, not at a solution, but at a deeper paradox. Proof of the crime appeared almost 10 years later, yet rather than providing finality, it opened new breaches in logic. From that riverside stretch, the tale of D.B. Cooper gained another layer, one framing him neither as survivor nor fatality, but as an enigma, still moving between categories. And with that, conversation shifted toward perhaps the greatest question of all. Did he live through the leap, or had silence already claimed him the moment he stepped into the wind? Was he a master who vanished with skill, or a man claimed by wind and wilderness? That question still divides people, even after years of searching and endless files of theories. We know the leap was daring. What remains uncertain is whether it was survivable. On one hand, the calmness Cooper showed makes it easy to picture him as trained, prepared, and fully aware of how to turn darkness into escape. On the other, the details suggest rash choices, mistakes waiting to happen in the cold November night. His fate lives in the space between these two extremes, confidence on one side, peril on the other. Begin with the equipment. He selected parachutes that at best were ordinary and in one case even outdated. One chute he took belonged to older military stock, less maneuverable than modern versions and far less reliable in steering. To those who study parachuting, this choice alone raises doubts. A skilled expert would likely demand something newer, knowing the risks of jumping blind into rough terrain with minimal control. Yet he accepted what the airline and FBI provided without complaint, and strapped one of these onto his back as if it was good enough. This detail feels strange if he was truly seasoned, yet it could also speak to a deliberate comfort with whatever was available, as though he had seen worse before. Now picture the setting into which he leapt. The sky was thick with cold rain, winds gusted across the mountains, and below him stretched miles of deep forest and river that still appear vast today. Even trained paratroopers call such a drop difficult. The night offered no visibility, no simple markers, and no lights below to guide a descent. By the time he pushed into that stormy air, the temperature was freezing at the altitude where the plane flew low. One wrong move might mean being dragged into the canopy of firs, or striking harshly against grounded rocks and rivers swollen with autumn rain. The danger was not imagined. It was real and immediate, created equally by weather, landscape, and equipment. Many argue that no person could walk away from such a leap unchanged, let alone carry out a perfect escape. Experts in survival have said the odds leaned strongly against him. Heavy rain and darkness reduced chances further, especially when a parachute without steering drops someone roughly wherever the wind takes them. Once on the ground, conditions were no kinder. Near freezing temperatures, thick brush, and fast water would all test endurance. Add to this the weight of the ransom strapped tightly against his body, $200,000 in $20 bundles, and we see a man descending with both risk and burden. Surviving the fall did not guarantee safety after landing. He would then face miles of unforgiving terrain with little food, little light, and no clear direction outward. To many, this seems like a plan destined not for freedom, but for collapse. And yet, consider the counterpoint. Calmness marked every step he took on that aircraft. He never rushed. He prepared his jump quietly, as though rehearsed. That kind of composure suggests experience, the kind one expects from a person with training, perhaps from military service or similar exposure to parachuting. Those who support the idea of survival believe only someone who had knowledge and confidence would attempt the act at all. Outdated gear and poor weather might be less of a barrier to someone conditioned for hardship. Perhaps He trusted his body, his skill, and his planning in ways that ordinary observers find impossible to imagine. The lack of evidence deepens this possibility. Despite enormous searches, no body, no clothing, and no equipment tied conclusively to him have surfaced. Ordinary accidents often leave behind remains. Broken pieces of parachute fabric, snapped lines, or bone fragments can persist for decades in forests. Rivers sometimes yield evidence years later. Yet with Cooper, there has been nothing. Only the small amount of money found on the Columbia River has connected back. And even that raised more contradictions, not resolution. If he perished quickly, why not more evidence in the zones carefully searched? The emptiness might be argued as proof of someone who landed with enough control to walk away unnoticed. But counter-arguments rise just as quickly. One explanation for the lack of remains is the sheer vastness of the region. Dense growth swallows material. Rivers shift paths and bury things beneath layers of silt. Wild animals scatter remains and erase traces in surprisingly short time. In regions like this, silence can easily last not just years, but lifetimes. It is possible he died, and that the natural world simply absorbed him into it until no clear trace remained. What, after all, is more effective at hiding someone than millions of acres of untouched land? This tension between the two paths, survival and death, has shaped the case ever since. If he survived, then the letter of his plan succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. He walked silently away with cash in hand and never surfaced again. If he perished, then luck deceived his calmness. He stepped boldly into the night, thinking he would succeed, only to be claimed immediately by the wilderness he underestimated. Both ideas live side by side because neither completely closes the door on the other. His skill suggests escape. The environment suggests doom. Both exist in equal measure, leaving debate unsettled. Reflect on how unusual this paradox is. History has many stories of attempts gone wrong, and many of brilliant escapes pulled off cleanly. Here we find something different, evidence balanced between the two in ways that will not tilt. Too skilled to think of his act as reckless, too dangerous a scene to believe in certain success. He sits permanently between failure and triumph, his leap frozen as a question never resolved. The absence of his body keeps imagination alive. Had he been found lifeless in a field or tangled in trees, the story would be one of brief audacity ending in tragedy. Instead, his fate hangs open, like the parachute he might or might not have steered. This open space defines his legacy just as strongly as the details of the hijacking. We know what he did before the jump. We do not know what happened after. And in that uncertainty, the story survives. This is why Cooper endures, not only because of what he took or how he boarded, but because his choice sits at the crossroads of possible survival and likely death. Neither truth has replaced the other, so time itself carries them forward equally. When you picture him in that descent, suit pressed, reins striking, money fastened against his body, you are picturing both outcomes at once. A man walking away, a man vanishing forever. Perhaps that is the real mystery. Improbability itself holds him aloft. Probability says survival was slim. Probability also says some evidence should have surfaced if he fell fatally. Each side leans on logic, but both are correct at once in their own reasoning. His story remains suspended because certainty never landed. And so when the search shifted from the question of if he lived, attention turned instead toward who he might have been. What name in life could give shape to the figure who, for one November night, became legend at 18E? For decades after the jump, attention shifted toward names and faces that seemed to echo the quiet figure who once sat in seat 18E. Each man suggested possibility. Each man carried traits that might line up with the description of D.B. Cooper. And yet, in the end, none of them ever matched in a way that closed the case. As we settle into this part of the story, imagine the investigators building profiles late into the night, their walls cluttered with photographs and notes, each line connecting toward an answer, only to be cut short. One of the most discussed men was Robert Rackstraw. He was a former Army helicopter pilot known for his wide experience in aviation and survival. His record showed both intelligence and a complicated past. Investigators noticed how his training seemed almost too perfect to dismiss. He knew about parachuting. He had the kind of confidence one might expect from someone who could board a plane and carry out such a plan. There were even reports of coded messages and letters tied to the Cooper case, with some suggesting hidden meanings pointing back to him. To imagine him as Cooper is simple. He carried the look, the skills, and even a history that seemed to blend with the myth. But suspicion was not proof. For all the theories, for all the connections, documents, and interviews, never placed him firmly in that seat. Like the night sky Cooper vanished into, Rackstraw's profile offered only shadows of certainty. Kenneth Christensen became another name held strongly in the narrative. He worked for Northwest Orient Airlines, the very company whose plane Cooper had hijacked. Before that, he had a history in the military, giving him access to skills and knowledge that aligned with the hijack. Picture the neatness of the match. A man familiar with aircraft operations, comfortable in situations tied to aviation, wearing the quiet air of someone capable of walking unnoticed into a passenger seat. People who knew him said he carried himself with calm. In that way, he resembled the composed figure passengers later described. Some even pointed to physical similarities, stature, features, even the style in which he dressed. For years, people found this overlap hard to ignore. Still, photographs and testimonies never gave the definitive moment of certainty. Just as with Rackstraw, suspicion hung near but never tipped into conclusion. Then there was Richard McCoy. His connection came not only from resemblance, but from action. In 1972, only months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy carried out his own strikingly similar attempt. He boarded a Boeing 727, the same type of aircraft, and demanded ransom. He even used the aft stairs, echoing the method Cooper had revealed to the world. For many observers, the comparison seemed almost too close to dismiss. If you wanted to find someone who looked and acted like Cooper, McCoy stepped neatly into the frame. Yet his case carried differences as well. Unlike Cooper, he was caught soon after his attempt. His trial, conviction, and eventual death ruled him out in official reporting. Investigators believed that the copycat nature of his act was just that, an imitation, not the original. Still, when people hear both stories side by side, it is difficult not to picture them belonging to the same man, or at least to imagine McCoy studying Cooper's success as a model for his own crime. Each of these men created compelling possibilities. Rackstraw, the soldier with coded messages; Christensen, the airline insider with a background that aligned all too neatly; McCoy, the imitator whose own actions mirrored the hijacking, almost step for step. They all carried fragments of Cooper's ghost upon them, and yet, when tested against the detail needed for closure, the match slipped. Rackstraw denied involvement. Concrete proof never circled back to Christensen. McCoy's record was similar, but too late, too exposed, and too flawed to be Cooper's original act of vanishing. It is here that the tension of the case grows sharper rather than clearer. Imagine the investigators trying to hold one of these men onto the line of certainty, only to find the line cut. The traits matched, yes. The histories aligned, yes. But certainty never came. All that remained were files filled with photographs, timelines, and written assessments, each stopping just before the final word. No confession, no physical proof, no serial numbers of ransom bills tucked into a drawer. Each profile stayed just out of reach. Suspicion is powerful in stories like this. When a name fits too many parts of a description, we fill in the rest with imagination. A man with flight training must know how to jump. A man with airline experience must know how to hide within a plane. A man who commits a nearly identical act, months later, must surely know the secret behind the first attempt. But imagination alone cannot carry a case, at least not in the evidence books of law and record. In those, imagination must be proven. In these examples, it was never proven. Think of how each suspect also shaped the legend itself. Rackstraw's supposed codes created intrigue in the idea that Cooper wanted to be remembered. Christensen's quiet demeanor fed the story of the hijacker as polite, composed, and careful. McCoy's imitation showed how one dramatic act could inspire another, how legends spark copycats. In this way, the suspects became part of the larger myth. They were not Cooper, but they became mirrors through which we view him. Each one suggests something about who we think he could have been, even without final proof. Over time, debates around suspects almost outgrew the act itself. Writers, investigators, and curious minds kept asking, why does each man carry such strong echoes and yet escape final naming? Some theorized that Cooper was none of them, that true identity slipped past notice completely, belonging to a man whose name was never tested. Others believed that Cooper may well have been someone like them, but that the weight of evidence vanished in time, making it impossible to hold forever. And so, to this day, arguments continue without conclusion. The lesson in this parade of suspects is one of fragments. Each offers part of the picture without the entire frame. Together, they remind us that Cooper's mystery is built not only from the man who jumped, but from the line of people mistaken for him afterward. Those faces, with their parallels and disconnections, slowly became stitched into the story. They are reasons why the case remains alive in imagination. Each could have been him. None of them were him, and so the list of names closes with the same emptiness with which it began. Rackstraw, Christensen, McCoy, each figure entices, each one stretches toward the solution, but none can rest finally as D.B. Cooper. The mystery lives on exactly because these suspects never passed that last test of certainty. We are left instead with almost. This refusal of resolution keeps the case not only open, but strangely alive. It refuses to settle. In time, the search for Cooper even turned to his belongings, picking apart fibers and dust for whispers of truth. And on one particular object, a simple tie left behind on seat 18E, science itself began to look more closely at what silent fragments were waiting there. Years passed after the hijacking, And those search parties had long since left the forests and rivers quiet again. Tiny clues remained tucked away in evidence boxes. What Cooper left behind was little. His tie, a few cigarette butts, some slips of detail too small to inspire answers at the time. But as science grew, investigators returned to these fragments with new eyes. In place of wide helicopter searches and drawn maps, research turned toward dust, fibers, and microscopic traces. The man disappeared, but the things he touched still whispered lightly of his presence in 18E. The tie stood out in particular. Plain, dark, and clip-on, it remained on his seat after he stepped into the night. On its surface and within its folds, scientists began to search for evidence that older methods could not see. When examined closely, particles of metal were discovered, far too specific to dismiss as random lint or dirt. These tiny flecks suggested something more structured, hints of materials often found in certain specialized industries. Suddenly, the tie became more than an accessory left behind in haste. It became a fragment of a background, a sliver of a workplace once familiar to him. Imagine holding that tie under a microscope. Within its fibers lie specks invisible to the human eye, each with a history of its own. Researchers later believed some of these particles linked to metals used in aircraft construction or tests tied to aerospace projects of the time. If true, the presence of such material would suggest Cooper worked or spent time close to those environments. It narrowed the possibility of his past, hinting away from coincidence and toward connection, perhaps to a manufacturing floor, perhaps to corporate labs, perhaps even tied to Boeing, the very company behind the jet he chose for his leap. This kind of work was carried forward by scientists like Tom Kay, who joined volunteer efforts to study the tie and encourage testing of objects left behind. His methods included searching pollen and dust in hopes of drawing patterns. If certain trace elements were unique to a geographic region, they might help point to locations Cooper once visited. Picture that kind of research as cartography on the smallest scale, where rather than maps of rivers and hills, one studies grains of pollen under glass to trace back to hidden origins. Each grain becomes a marker, pushing the possible story of Cooper's past outward into the world he might have walked in daily life. The metallic remnants in particular drew much discussion. Some particles were aluminum, others titanium, and several carried properties recognizable from environments where aircraft were crafted and tested during the late 1960s and 70s. While one explanation could be simple accident, particles transferred by handling from someone else, the persistence of multiple flecks suggested a closer relationship. Investigators looked seriously at whether Cooper could have been tied to aerospace projects, industrial plants, or companies where such metals circulated in daily use. In this light, the tie ceased to be an overlooked item and instead became a possible thread stretching back into his ordinary life before becoming extraordinary on November 24, 1971. Of course, these hints did not end the mystery in a burst of certainty. Just as with suspects, the closer one examined the trace evidence, the more questions emerged. Could Cooper have simply bought the tie second-hand with particles already clinging to it? Could he have handled it through unrelated work in metals? And most troubling of all, why leave it behind if habitual to wear? Each question opened new doubts. In this, the fragments mirrored the larger case, always providing enough detail to spark curiosity, never enough to hold final truth. Alongside examination of the tie came attempts at using DNA science. At the time of the hijack, few could imagine that residue like saliva on a cigarette butt might, decades later, yield genetic markers. Yet when forensic labs gained the ability to test such material, investigators retrieved the butts Cooper had left in his seat ashtray. They hoped for a profile strong enough to match against known suspects. The work did yield some results, but ultimately they proved inconclusive. DNA strands must be robust, and with years of storage, contamination, and limited sample size, the line broke before producing certainty. The presence of genetic material lived only as a faint path never fully connected. The tie itself also bore efforts for DNA testing. Skin oils or particles might sleep in the fabric weave, but again, results did not rest on unshakable ground. At best, only partial profiles surfaced, and they fell short in comparison work. The case carried on with a tantalizing suggestion that Cooper's body had indeed touched and lingered upon these small objects, but with the frustrating reminder that technology had not yet pushed far enough to anchor them to a single name. Microscopic dust, pollen grains, leftover flakes of titanium, traces of human DNA, all filled files with fascinating margins of possibility. They gave shape to new ideas of who the man might have been. Perhaps a professional tied to aviation technology, perhaps someone familiar with heavy machinery and industry, or someone living near specialized industrial projects. Each clue expanded the story beyond the small interior of Flight 305 into cities, factories, and lives spread across the American Northwest. But expansion is not resolution. In its way, the science gave weight to theories suggesting sophistication. If Cooper lived among aerospace workers and carried their particles on his tie into that flight, it would help explain his knowledge of the Boeing 727's unique aft stairs and his comfort aboard the jet. If his life had been tied to aviation, then parachutes and flight patterns may not have been mysteries to him. What was once thought reckless on his part, like choosing unusual parachutes, may have been steady choices made with insider understanding. The evidence could be seen as a whisper of expertise, not accident. But just as easily, each scientific exploration also reminded us how elusive certainty remains. Dust is not identity. Pollen is not a name. DNA, when incomplete, says less than it promises. Each result continues the case without closure. Cooper becomes not less mysterious, but more. Instead of absence alone, we now feel his trace through specks and particles too small to see, but large enough to stir possibilities. He lingers in material as though suspended, hidden, waiting behind microscopes as much as in memories. As stories go, his has adapted. Where once men searched ridges and riverbanks for broken parachute lines, now scientists search fibers for tiny metallic flecks. The hunt has shrunk from hundreds of square miles into microns of evidence. Yet, in both scales, the pattern holds. The effort grows, dedication deepens, and certainty never appears. Cooper remains untouchable, never caught by helicopters or by science. What stands clear is that the mystery moves with time. Each generation of tools picks up where the last left off. Whether through wide sweeps of land or thin glass slides under microscopes, the chase reawakens. Yet, finality never arrives. Cooper is always what he was that night, a figure who fades into wind, leaving only traces that seem almost enough, but never complete. And so the enigma persists, carrying forward not by absence alone, but by adaptation. From forests to rivers, from ties to microscopes, each effort changes shape, but ends the same. He remains elusive, an echo and evidence that refuses to fade. Each clue encourages curiosity. Each fragment suggests skill, but none complete the picture. That is why the case still feels alive long after the leap. It grows with new disciplines, yet never closes. Even at its smallest scale, the mystery endures. The mystery of D.B. Cooper lingers because it rests in balance, decisive control on the plane, then complete disappearance into silence. His story feels both finished and unfinished, a moment frozen in midair. Perhaps what draws us isn't the leap itself, but the quiet he left behind. That silence leaves each of us to imagine his fate, shaping countless possibilities without closure. In a way, Cooper's true legacy is not in money lost or searches failed, but in how his absence continues to live inside questions. And maybe that's why, even now, his shadow feels so strangely close.